Alright, so today I'm going to be talking about another important entity linking method. And here we are using type modeling in a different way. I mean, our types are now latent because we modeled them. And after modeling them, then it becomes an input, just one of several inputs that goes to our algorithm, and we can understand the entity linking. Linking mentions to entity, as you know. So I focus on this paper, 2020, and what is the motivation? Sometimes fine-grained type information is not available. You know, you are familiar with UMLS types. There are several types. It's a hierarchy. It's very beautiful, intuitive, descriptive, very interesting. But the fine grain is not always available. So entity linking is the task of linking mentions of named entities in natural language text to entities in a curated knowledge base. This is of significant importance in the biomedical domain, where it could be used to semantically annotate a large volume of clinical records and biomedical literature to standardize concepts described in an ontology such as UMLS. We observe that with precise type information, entity disambiguation becomes a straightforward task. However, fine-grained type information is usually not available in biomedical domain. So the motivation is that fine-grained type information is not available. And here is an example of biomedical entity linking. So these are the types. It starts with T. And for example, this type, if you look at UMLS, it means findings. It corresponds to the category of finding. Or another one is category of qualitative. And sometimes there are several mentions that leads to just one type. There are several like fractures of the long bones, and many of them correspond to the same type. And the idea is that they propose LATTE, a latent type in entity linking model that improves entity linking by modeling the latent variable about mentions and entities. So unlike previous methods that perform entity linking directly between the mentions and entities, LATTE jointly does entity disambiguation and latent fine-grained type learning without direct supervision. It means that we don't say this mention, this type, this mention, this type. There is no. We model that indirectly because we have another thing which is entity linking. So we infer. So it's like Z, if you are familiar with autoencoders, variation auto, we consider as Z. But in this paper, they do it a much easier approach. They use a much easier approach, and so they evaluate their model on two biomedical datasets. As you know, MedMentions is very important because it's a large-scale public dataset annotated with UMLS concepts, and the identified corpus of dictated doctors' notes. So these are the datasets. So this is an example. You have this mention in this text, and you link it to this. So an example biomedical phrase shown in red is the extracted mention. And the orange boxes refer to the top candidate, for example, the first candidate, the second candidate, and so on. But the ground truth is this one, which could be just one of those rank entities as well. But if we are wrong, then we miss that. So the difference of entity linking in biomedical domain with other domains are very simple. They don't have such a large entity, and the kind of ambiguities in biomedical domain is huge. That's why I like these challenging topics, biomedical texts. So if you do NLP in biomedical domain, it means a lot. rather than doing simple domains that have little information and databases. But biomedical domain has lots of ontologies, databases, so it's pretty challenging. You should design new novel algorithms to handle that. So the difference is that the first dimensions can be ambiguous, as I said. Second, the candidates can be similar with each other, not only in surface, but also in semantic meaning. Another challenge in my medical entity linking is that dimensions and the context are usually longer in length as compared to general domain. This makes the traditional entity linking techniques less effective on medical text. And finally, medical text contains many domain-specific terminologies, as well as abbreviations and typos. Thus, many terms cannot be found in, for example, pre-trained glove, and so you have some problems. So these are types of entities in UMLS. If you go to the website, for example, type T047 corresponds to semantic type name, disease, or syndrome. And we have 11,000 of them. And the percentage that they are used in our vocabulary is just 1.7. So this is important if you want to talk about fairness and those things. So the challenge of entity linking biomedical text is that a key observation in the process of entity linking is that if we have the fine-grained types of mention in the raw text and types of entities in the knowledge base, entity disambiguation becomes much easier. And for example, this figure 2a, each candidate has different semantic type from UMLS network. So if we can infer the correct mention type, which is in this case most likely is disease or syndrome, we can make the correct linking. So the latent types, as I said, we argue that the fine-grained types do exist. And so this is an example. And the relation constraint. One constraint is the binary pairwise relation between mention and each candidate's entities. So specifically, if one candidate is the ground truth entity for a given mention, for this mention, the relation between them is labeled as 1, otherwise 0. So we can learn the latent types from this pairwise information. So there are a hierarchy. We can make use of coarse-grained known types. Note that known types can be of any kind and not necessarily semantic types from the UMLS semantic networks. Regardless of the number of known types, we consider them as coarse-grained, as we can always model finer-grained types. The known types are usually generic in nature and they can be further divided into subtypes. So we train it jointly, entity linking, and we have two type classification. Remember that we have mention type and entity type. So so you should do it for two different classifications. And of course we merge them because this is one classification for mention type, the other one for candidate type, but we merge these information just to get the final ranking score. And the third input is just, I will explain, that comes from just the text for mention in the text, mention with context, because mention alone doesn't have meaning. You should see it in context. And also the candidate, so we get all of these information to observe that say what is the rank, for example, saying what is the rank that this mention goes with that candidate. Mention I goes with J's candidate, J's entity candidate, So the embedding layer, as you say, we concatenate word embedding and character embedding, as you have seen in many papers, because it has a better semantic understanding. And the encoder, we use BiLSTM, left and right, and we concatenate, so everything is normal. And so finally, we use the cross-attention layer, because we should gather all information from the mention from the entity, and we compute the mention to candidate attention. And so this is the mention to candidate attention. And finally, they use a ReLU nonlinearity, and this part is linear, and then give it to this nonlinearity. So we finally get the F score, the score relevant score F between the two sequences. So the distribution similarity could be as an input to obtain the ranking score. The distribution similarity. So that latent type similarity. And this layer checks the output state of the encoder and then concatenates them to form a fixed dimensional vector for the mention and U for the candidate. So these are type classifiers, very easy. And finally, we have ranking. As I said, ranking score, we need three inputs from one of the classifier, from the other classifier, and from the context. So we have three inputs. So finally we get the rank. And the optimization is easy because it's just a classifier, and also for mention candidate ranking, we use this ranking loss. And the data sets this mentions, if you are working biomedical checks, is very important. And also you should know UMLS, mesh, and those things if you want to work to apply, to leverage NLP for biomedical checks. And for candidate generation, they use this article. And for hierarchical losses and new resources for fine-grained entity typing and linking. So they take just the top 9 most similarity entities because it's a huge number. So we should rank it. We should know at least among several candidates, we pick the top 9 most similar entities.